To learn more about earning college credits with study hall courses, go to gostudyhall.com or click on the link in the description. Traveling can sometimes be a huge drag. I mean, have you ever taken a long road trip? I'm having flashbacks to hours of my dad's old cassette tapes. Well, travel was even worse before we had things like planes, trains, cars, and electric scooters. First, traveling by land was slow. Second, there were tons of pitfalls, like thieves and raiders. And if you had to cross a mountain range or a desert, well, forget it. Travel by sea wasn't that much safer. Seas could be rough and ships easily misdirected, but it sure was faster. And as travel became easier, the connections among peoples, communities, and empires grew bigger than ever. I'm Rob Fuller, and this is Study Hall, Modern World History. Like everything in history, these advancements in sea travel didn't happen overnight, but over many centuries, beginning in the Indian Ocean. See, oceanic trade first started to develop way back in 3500 BCE, and the Indian Ocean took off as the epicenter of world trade in about 1200 CE. This was mostly due to the savvy work of Muslim merchants who figured out how to dominate trade on land first. In the 13th century, those merchants were able to take advantage of the Silk Road trade routes, newly revived by Genghis Khan and the Mongols. Muslim traders took advantage of the Silk Road to expand their reach from their home base in Persia all the way across Europe, Africa, Asia, and India. And unlike other traders, Muslim merchants hand-delivered goods instead of using a go-between, which helped them build strong connections with their trade partners. But that wasn't enough for these merchants. They wanted easier access to their trade networks in order to move goods more quickly, turn a better profit, and monitor their trade partners more closely. They realized that traveling by sea would get them to Africa, India, and Southeast Asia more quickly, and massive cargo ships would allow them to move goods in larger quantities too. And as an added plus, ocean travel helped traders dodge dangers like land wars and the Black Death. As they set out into the Indian Ocean, innovations in maritime technology, like the floating Chinese compass, helped them to perfect their sailing abilities. And they used those ancient monsoon routes to speed up their journeys. Just as the Mongols united their empire through the Silk Road, Muslim merchants formed partnerships across continents, including with the Chinese, which allowed them to shape trade economies to suit their legal and religious practices. It also helped them expand trade throughout the Indian Ocean and increase their profits. But for Muslim states, tying trade to religion had some drawbacks. Their control of trade throughout Eurasia caught the attention of the Christian empires of Europe, who wanted to stop the spread of the Islamic faith and have more control over luxury goods from Asia. Things became even more complicated when the Islamic Ottoman Empire expanded and took control of the western portion of the Silk Road. Religious conflicts became violent and significantly disrupted trade. In the mid-15th century, the Ottomans boycotted trade with Europe and closed the Silk Road, forcing those Western empires now to find other ways to access Eastern goods. This led the Europeans to traverse a new frontier, the Atlantic. One of those European empires that needed a new way to trade was Portugal. King Manuel I sent explorers out into the Atlantic Ocean to seek a sea route and established trading posts around the southern tip of Africa to access East African gold and Indian spices. The Portuguese also wanted to displace Islam as the dominant faith in the Indian Ocean, pushing for Catholicism instead. And seeing how rich and lucrative the Indian Ocean trade economy was, Portugal wanted to control it for themselves. They'd already been engaged in religious wars with the Muslims throughout the Crusades, and since violence had worked well so far, they doubled down on their efforts to attack Muslim cities along the western shores of the Indian Ocean. As word spread about Portuguese ruthlessness, Muslim cities began to voluntarily accept Portuguese authority instead of fighting back. And by 1510, the Portuguese had taken control of several important coastal cities in India and Indonesia. This significantly expanded their reach and power, establishing a new trading route around modern-day Cape Town and up the eastern coast of Africa, with ports in Mombasa and Mozambique cutting across the Indian Ocean right to Calicut. But the Portuguese weren't the only Europeans with skin in the oceanic trade game. In 1602, a group of merchants founded the Dutch East India Company to protect the Dutch Republic's access to trade of luxury goods in the Indian Ocean. They sailed along the Brouwer Route, which ran south through the North Atlantic, circled the southern tip of Africa, then sailed north through the Indian Ocean to land in Jakarta, Indonesia. The Brouwer Route was a big deal for the Dutch because it cut their travel time in half. With easier access to the Indian Ocean world, the Dutch worked even harder to take over trade in the region. The Dutch government gave the Dutch East India Company free rein to build forts in coastal cities, manage armed forces, and even form treaties with local rulers. Under the command of fierce generals like Jan Pieterszoon Koen, the company defeated the Portuguese fleet and replaced them as the main European power in the Indian Ocean. But the fight wasn't over just yet. The British East India Company was also operating trading posts throughout the Indian Ocean beginning in the 17th century. The two trading companies became fierce economic competitors, often setting up trading posts right next to each other and bad-mouthing the competition to potential customers. Funny enough, it was success in a totally different ocean that clinched European victory in the Indian Ocean. Trade and colonization across the Atlantic left Spain with a glut of silver, while France got rich off beaver pelts, and the Portuguese profited off of sugar, gold, and coffee in Brazil. Three of my favorite things. The wealth these nations gained from transatlantic trade was just what they needed to beat out the competition in the Indian Ocean. Europeans' desire for faster access to better stuff fueled the expansion of their control of oceanic trade throughout the Indian Ocean region and in the Northeast Atlantic, but actually crippled the pre-existing 2,000-year-old trade networks already in the area. These European trading companies were late to the game and took advantage of trade routes that Asian and Muslim traders had established millennia earlier, all for their own personal gain. And as Europeans began to dominate trade, they brought new and important goods with them, which helped them compete in the marketplace. Take the Spanish, for example. In 1565, the Spanish Empire established its first colony in Asia in the Philippines, and set up a colonial outpost in Manila a few years later in 1571. Spain's primary trade route to the Americas ran eastward through the Pacific from Manila to Acapulco in Mexico, which was a pretty innovative move at the time because other European empires used the Cape of Good Hope trade route that ran west around the southern tip of Africa. While Polynesian ships sailed the waves of the Pacific for centuries, Spain's fleet of trading ships became the sole arbiter of world trade in this area. These ships, called Manila galleons, sailed just once a year, so you didn't want to miss that boat. The voyage was long and dangerous, with almost constant storms and rough currents. But if everything went according to plan, Manila galleons would arrive in the Philippines just 6 months after their departures from Acapulco. And it turns out that 6 months of cabin fever could be worth it, because once they hit the American shores with their shipload of luxury goods, Spanish merchants totally made bank. Once their trade negotiations were complete, the Manila galleons headed back to the Philippines loaded up with American silver. But European empires' thirst for power, new commodities, and better trade networks didn't end there. They eventually broadened their reach all the way to the Polynesian Pacific. At the same time, Oceania produced many useful commodities, so when European explorers accessed the Polynesian Pacific, they wrestled control from, the local chiefs by offering the protection of their firearms and used these alliances as a way to worm their way into the region's trade economy and set up new colonies. Eventually, the Spanish established a trade route between the Caroline Islands in the Pacific, Manila, and Acapulco. So by the 18th century, even the Polynesian Pacific had been drawn into the global trade network expanded by European empires. The world's economic powers were more connected now than ever before. But with all this new wealth and industry, Spain needed a lot of manual labor. The success of the Spanish Empire in the Americas was built on the enslavement of indigenous peoples, but before long, the horrors of enslavement, disease, and war devastated the indigenous population. So, the Spanish chose to use their trade route in a new way, to buy, sell, and enslave people from other parts of the world. With the reach of oceanic travel, Spanish merchants found new sources of forced labor in places like the Philippines, India, and the coast of Africa. This new form of travel led to the start of an even darker chapter in the long and devastating history of Europeans as enslavers. One such story started back around 1610 and brings together all of the trade routes and global connections we've discussed today. First, Portuguese merchants kidnapped a girl from India and shipped her across the Indian Ocean to the Philippines, where she was then sold to the highest bidder. She was sold again and again, leading her across the Pacific Ocean on Spanish trading ships to Puebla, Mexico. She spent several years as a domestic servant in the Spanish colonies and was finally granted her freedom only when her enslaver died. But with no family, job, or savings, she had no choice but to continue working as a domestic servant, but this time for a priest. Over time, she became devoted to the Catholic faith and hoped to join a convent. But the priest pressured her to marry instead. When she was eventually widowed, she began to live the religious life that she had wanted to for years, and in the process became famous for her piety and spiritual visions. And even though she was never formally canonized in the Catholic Church, the Spanish colonists who knew her story revered her as a saint, calling her Catarina de San Juan. Although Catarina is one of the most famous examples of the Oceanic exchange of people as property, her story of forced immigration was not unusual. And not all enslaved people got an epilogue of sainthood. Catarina was just one of thousands of people from Asia and Africa who were bought and sold along these new oceanic trade routes in the 17th century. Oceanic trade routes created more connections between people and cultures around the world, both economically and politically, than ever before. And as trade grew, so did empires' greed for wealth and power. This led to some amazing advancements in sea travel, like new technologies and world-class trade ships, but it also led Europeans to expand one of the worst human inventions of all time: chattel slavery. While monsoon winds and the ocean's tides are up to nature, humans choose how to navigate the sea and how to use it to expand their reach across the globe. The ripple effects of these choices would continue to change the world for centuries to come. If you're enjoying Study Hall Modern World History and are interested in taking an online course and earning college credit, go to gostudyhall.com or click on this button to learn more. Thanks for watching. See you next time.